Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mark Anthony's Music Picks. Today's episode number 123. And the inspiration for today's episode came from one of the comments that one of my subscribers left on my last Progressive House Picks video, where they said, "Oh, thank God you did another Progressive House video. I haven't seen one for a while." So that inspired me because I had this episode on deck for probably 3 or 4 months now. I was trying to assemble the records that I was going to present to you. And just recently, I was able to find, I only had 4 records initially in the episode, and I like to try to get 5 or 6 at least. And I had 2 more sort of come into my world that I thought really fit the bill for this. So then I decided to pull the trigger on it. So today I'm going to give you what I'm considering to be my favorite Progressive House sleeper hits. And for me, Progressive House, obviously, it's been around since at least the early 90s, and it still continues to today in various forms. But when a lot of people my age, I'm in my early 40s now, when we talk about Progressive House, trance addict people that were on the trance addict forums, what we really mean is the 2000 to 2005 window. That's like the real OG Progressive House era where people became real true fanboys of it and were obsessed with it. I just looking at it now, even though Progressive House is still around, you still have labels like Bedrock and All Day I Dream and Shanti, which I guess are progressive. I don't think they have the same cult-like fanboy status as some of the old Progressive House producers, labels, and mixed compilations used to have. I don't think it's the same level of reverence and obsession that you used to see back in the day that you still see now. And maybe that's because there were less people making it, so the supply of Progressive House was less diluted. I feel like now people get distracted, and this even applies to myself. When I'm listening to records now, I feel like I have a tendency to get distracted with the new shiny thing that just came out, and a lot of times I don't take enough time to sit and really absorb and memorize and become fully knowledgeable about the records that I purchase. So I guess that's maybe a sign of the times. But anyways, I have 6 Progressive House sleeper hit picks for you today that I really think you guys are going to enjoy these. And the best part about this is a lot of times when I come here and I'm showing off older records in my collection, they're expensive, and part of me, I almost feel like kind of like a accidental smugness. I really don't ever want to come off as if I'm showing off on my channel. It's more like, look what I found. And I do feel bad, like when I was doing the Trance Wax episode and I see some of the records are selling for $200. It's like, that sucks. It sucks that it would cost $200 because if somebody likes what they discovered in my episode, they're gonna go and look and say, I'm not spending $200 on it. And it's kind of like, it's kind of, I guess, sucky is the best way to put it. But in this episode, everything in here is available for less than $15, and some of these are $3 records. And that's what I think makes them sleeper hits. First up is a classic Progressive House producer. Well, I was talking about Progressive House producers having fanboys and achieving almost like godlike status in the eyes of many of the fans back in the day. We're back to talking about Matthew Dekay again, and here he's paired up with his friend that he sometimes produced with, and that is, I guess, Rube? I want to say Rob V. I don't know why it's not Rob, but it's Rube V. I don't know much about Rube V, but I do know that this duo here, Matthew Dekay and Rube V, this came together very well in the Luna in the Dark. Now, this has 2 versions of it. Both are good, but the one that I like is the original A-side mix. Oh, actually, it's not 2 versions. They're 2 different tracks. But the Luna in the Dark on the A-side. This, I just discovered this recently, and I paid $3 for it. I got a near mint or a high VG plus, and I love it. I absolutely love this record. If you sit and listen to all the elements of it, this is like everything that 2002 Progressive House could be, all in one bundle. And my favorite part, if you listen to this sample, just you can hear the classic adding of elements. There's a nice hand clap that's introduced in the sample. But my favorite is when this bass line just starts to roll in. It's just one of those subtle additions to the track where it's like kick, clap, and some effects, and then comes the bass line, and oh man, is that so smooth. And right as the bass line introduces, you get like a nice little whoosh, like a traditional progressive whoosh. And then almost like some of the elements that you would hear in a Donato Dazzi record in 2004 and 2005, like that twangy, tingy, tin acid sound. It just kind of like reverberates off into the distance. I never had a special moment with this track because like I said, I just discovered it. But I'm willing to bet that there are people out there that absolutely love this record. You know, from their dead hands will you pry it? Because I think this is something that really encapsulates what prog house could be. My next choice for you is by a progressive house duo named Cass and Slide or maybe it's Case and Slide, I don't know. This is the record. This is Glad I Ate Her, which is I guess a play on sexual innuendo / play on words, because the track that underlies this is the sequence that's played in the famous movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe. And specifically in that movie where Russell Crowe is walking through the wheat field, and I think he's like, it's almost like his happy place where he's contemplating his family. He lost his family, but he's walking through the wheat, and it's almost like that's the place where he reaches his serenity. That's what that is. But Cass and Slide as a duo would remix popular tracks, right? So Gladiator was a very, very popular movie, and I think the soundtrack was very popular too. And Cass and Slide also did another remix that really blew me away and that I still listen to. Never released on vinyl, but it was, if you remember the 80s hit by Trent D'Arby, it was called Sign Your Name Across My Heart, right? That track, I'll give you guys a picture of it. Mega 80s hit, and Cass and Slide did a remake of that. And here, I think the Gladiator track turned out really nice. It's, if you think of the mastering that was prominent in the early 2000s, it tended to lean a little bit more towards the bass side, even in, not just in progressive house, but in tech house and house records in general. Records back then used to have a little bit of a muddier, softer feel to them. I think this is a very good example of that. You'll be able to hear just a little bit more low end in the mix here. And it's just kind of like an understated progressive house track that I think you could play maybe somewhere in the middle of your set where you needed to bring the energy down, but you also wanted to have people really have an emotional experience. The track, The Wheat, in Gladiator, it's a girl basically just humming and singing in a, almost like a harmonic way, and you can feel pain in her voice, and it's sadness. And I think the way that ties into the Gladiator scene is that Russell Crowe is thinking about the loss of his family, and that's kind of like, even though he's mourning them, he's also in a place of relaxation and calm, and that's what that track creates. My next track actually isn't one that I found myself. I have to give credit to Seth Nichols to this. Seth is the owner and operator of Evolving Records, which is now known as Love Vinyl Records. And way back when, Seth somehow stumbled onto this 2002 hit, and a sleeper hit. It's by Rose Smith. Rose Smith made an album in the early 2000s on Glasgow Underground, and one of the tracks on there was called Life Changes. Now, I don't know anything about the original album. I didn't really have a chance to go listen to it before I made this, but there's a remix on here by a duo named Studio Blue. I don't know much about Studio Blue, and I also couldn't find a picture for them, but I will say that this track is crazy good. If I had to categorize this, I would say it's a slight fusion of, I can hear a little bit of house tribalness with the drum loop. I love the drum loop. It's got a tech house tempo, so maybe 124, 125 beats per minute. That's not really the selling point and the part that really wows you in this track, though. This track has the traditional warm, like I used to call it the come up bass. You know, if you felt like you were at the party and you were like starting to really get sucked into the moment, that's what this bass line is here. If you just listen to how deep and warm that is, that bass line is really what dominated some of the biggest tracks that you can think of in progressive house history. Like, for example, the Luke Chabal remix of You Are Sleeping. It has that same warm progressive bass that you can only get in this genre of house, and I absolutely just adore this record. And like I said in the beginning of this episode, these are cheap bargain bin records that nobody else wants, and that's why I'm presenting them to you here today. Deep Dish. If you think about Deep Dish, where they're at now, Ali and Sharam they've gone their separate ways, and I don't really follow either of them anymore. I think they lost their way, but I guess they're big enough for me to be able to say that, and you know, if it ever got back to them, they could take it. But back in the day, I feel like Deep Dish was better as a duo. I felt like they really had the party vibe on lock, and I think that the party vibe that Deep Dish was known for actually peaked around 2004 and 2005. They had a tendency in the early 2000s to make a little bit darker music. They were very much part of the dark progressive scene. Like, if you look at Creamer and K remixes, a lot of times that would be backed with a Deep Dish mix that was in the same vibe. But when you got to around 2004, 2005, 2006, Deep Dish started to lighten up, get a little bit more vocally, and it was almost like their music got brighter. And I feel like the pinnacle of that Deep Dish experience was their 2005 Essential mix. Now, I don't know if you guys remember that, but it had Pete Tong announcing the Essential Mix, there was a crowd noise factor. I don't know how they mixed the crowd noise into the mix, but the official Essential Mix has Pete Tong narrating, crazy crowd, cheering, whoops, all kinds of carrying on. And it just feeds into this experience. Like, it makes you really feel like you're there. So that 2005 Radio 1 Essential Mix, it led off with this track here. It was called I Love You. And it was a really bright and kind of odd fusion. Like, you might say, oh, Mark, that's a little bit of a stretch to call that progressive house. Well, I don't know what else to call it. I mean, it does have touches of tribal. And these two producers here, Tony Rojas and Marcos Cruz, they're both Spanish. So I guess you could say, all right, maybe it's 50% tribal, 50% progressive house. But the rest of the deep dish mix that this appeared in, I think, was more leaning towards progressive house. And the fact that I'm having trouble pinning it down to a genre, I think, is reflective of the change that dance music was going through. At that point, 2004 was the tail end of the Luke Chabal era, and electro was starting to come to light. And because electro hadn't fully taken over, it was like music was just a little bit lost and a little bit weird from 2005 to 2006. A lot of those records turned out to be disasters that haven't aged well, but I do think that this is something that still has aged well, and for me, it really has that sentimental value because I always think of the Deep Dish Radio Mix when I think of this. Most progressive house was dark. That's what it was known for. It was meant for clubs, and clubs were really prominent in the early 2000s, and for some reason it was just like the darkness of the club, the dinginess of it. It's almost like it fueled the vibe that progressive house was trying to create. Like, they went hand in hand. If you think about it, bright and uplifting house is most well suited to an outdoor daytime event where people are optimistic and being social and interacting. And then when you go to the flip side of that, a nightclub, it's dark, it's dingy. A lot of people aren't there to meet other people. Maybe they're there with their friends, maybe they're by themselves, but they're there for the music and they just want to go and escape. And that was what the clubs were for. And it's funny, I'm talking about clubs like they're extinct now. I mean, they almost are. And here, I think this is a great example. I mean, this is, if you want to talk about the epitome of dark progressive house, this is by a duo of artists that were very loved in the mid-2000s. This is RPO and Thomas Penton, and the track is called Perfect Storm. I discovered this via my friend Dave Stevens. He's a dear friend of mine, and he absolutely loved progressive house back in the day. And this was in his arsenal. This was one of his secret weapons. Not a lot of people knew about it. The track that I specifically like and that him and I sort of connected over was Perfect Storm Part 2. I remember the first time that Dave played it for me, we had been at a Sasha party at Emerald City together down in Philly. It was probably the best party that was maybe top 3 parties that were ever hosted at Emerald City in Philadelphia. And we went back to Dave's house and had some friends over, and he played a set for us and he dropped us. He's like, Mark, you got to hear this track. You're going to love it. And I absolutely did.
Lighting lights, radiating ray. That's from another world.
And my last pick for you, number 6 in this episode. You might find this to be a genre stretch too, but for some reason I always categorized it in my head as heavy dark progressive. This is a somewhat, I think, underloved, maybe underappreciated version of Green Velvet's La La Land on Relief Records here. He's got his little record railroad crossing logo there. You always knew that this was Green Velvet related if you saw this logo. I picked this up at 611 Records, now defunct, down in Philly. It was down on South Street, and it was some of my earliest in-person record buying experiences were there, and this was one of the first records that I picked up on my first trip there. I thought that this was, I was like surprised that this was still left in the bin because I liked it so much. And when I came back to make this episode, I didn't realize that it also had a Francois K remix on the one side and also an instrumental version of the original La La Land on it. So I gravitated towards and bought this for the Floppy Sounds mix. Now, Floppy Sounds is Rob Reeves, who had a short but productive career from maybe 2000 to 2005 in production. I'm not sure if he went off and did other aliases and may still be producing now. So if he is, I don't mean to insult him at all. Rob, I hope you're still making music, because this Floppy Sounds version turned out great. I absolutely love how the dystopian skull-crushing bass comes in during this drop. I'm gonna let you guys hear this during the sample, but you have the crazy lyrics of Green Velvet. And if I can take an aside here, one of the reasons that I love Green Velvet is because there's almost no idea that comes to that man's mind that he's not willing to make into a track. If you think about Flash, if you think about the lyrics to Flash, like his breakout mega hit that almost like launched his career, or the silly but accurateness of the track The Bathroom, or La La Land here that we're talking about, they're all just like ridiculous ideas that he jotted down, and where most people would say, nah, dude, don't make that into a track. Green Velvet did it, and he could pull it off, I guess because he's got a bright green mohawk. I mean, as soon as you see a guy with sunglasses like that and a bright green mohawk, like, all bets are off. He's allowed to make whatever he wants. And La La Land was probably by far his biggest hit from 2000 to 2005. I mean, there's probably, I'm not exaggerating, there's got to be 20 remixes of it. And it was such a remixable vocal because he so shamelessly just describes the dynamic of the club culture in that era. I mean, it got ugly. There were some people that were definitely using clubs as their escape hatch, and it's almost like you were resigning to this like state of dysfunction. If you went to these clubs and participated in them too often. So it's almost like an acknowledgement of the dysfunction of the culture, and I think people found it to be honest and appreciated it for that. But back to the Floppy Sounds vocal mix. Rob Reeves really killed it with this very dystopian, almost not out of sync, but like out of harmony synth lead that just comes in, and the tension that builds during the build up and the drop and releases is really something special.
Brain cells.
All right, and that's all for today's episode, guys. Please comment down below if you appreciated any of these progressive house sleeper hits. Stay tuned for my next episode next week. Take care.